Hey, welcome back, everybody. Last time I assigned a couple of videos about the Newark riots, which happened in July of 1967. Very tumultuous time in American history when the United States was actually a little bit like it is today. It was very, very divided. There was a lot of hostility over the Vietnam War, over civil rights, over all these issues, and there was a tremendous amount of inequality. And we're going to dive into that a little bit more today to kind of give the background story about how Newark got there and how it got to, well, some of the conditions that still exist today, that still characterize the city today. But we're going to talk about this and kind of give the same template as a recipe for what happened in a lot of other American cities after World War II. So, what we're going after today, and honestly, I may have to do this in two parts because there's a lot of stuff to cover. I'm hoping that after watching this that you understand a little bit better about how Newark drastically changed in the period following World War II. In a lot of ways, it was still an immigrant city, but a different kind of immigrant city, and one that became very different right before the Newark riots. This also kind of applies to the general ways that the United States was changing at this time. The economy of the United States was transforming from a very urban centered, very manufacturing factory kind of society towards more of the service suburban society that still kind of dominates today, even though urban population is on the rise in today's world. Also, we're going to look at some of the concrete forms of discrimination that really transformed Newark, that caused massive inequality and the eventual economic decay of Newark. This includes practices like redlining and blockbusting, practices in the real estate industry that exploited racism and exacerbated economic decay. We'll talk about that in detail. And we're going to look at the backdrop of civil rights in the United States. So we'll understand many of the underlying causes of the civil rights movement in the context of your city, our city, Newark, New Jersey. Okay, so I want to kind of set the backdrop by showing you how the population of America was changing at the turn of the 20th century. Here you can see the urban versus the rural population. And after the Civil War, consistently through the late 1800s, more people worked and lived in farming areas than in cities. But that's changing. And by 1920, with the growth of factories and industrial centers in the cities and in sectors like the finance sector in New York City, massive amounts of jobs attracted people to urban centers. Now we can see this in this table as well. If you see here is the date, and as time passes, you can see the total US population is going up and the total urban population is gaining, and it's gaining as a percentage of the total population. So as the population was going up, you can see that the percentage of the population becoming in the cities was going up as well. Now, look at Newark here. In 1860, right around the time of the Civil War, there are 0% out-of-state migrants coming to Newark, New Jersey. There's a lot of immigrants still, only about 1.8% black. By 1890, 12% of people are coming from out of state. And by 1920, 16.7% of people are coming from out of state. So a lot of that influx to northern cities, and you see this in a lot of cities, these out-of-state migrants coming from the Great Migration, people leaving the agricultural South and coming to look for factory jobs in the North. Now, this is actually an ethnic map of Newark and where the different nationalities predominated around 1911. So you can see there's about 50,000 Italians, and the way that this map is drawn, this is the Passaic River here, excuse me. So this is the Ironbound area, and this would be the Central Ward into the West Ward, and then over here you can see Weequahic down in this area. And up here, Branch Brook Park, here's the North Ward. So the North Ward was predominantly an Italian area. The West Ward was where you found, Vailsburg area, where you found a lot of the Irish population, also a lot of the Jewish population. Remember, Weequahic High School was predominantly a Jewish high school. Additionally, you had Barringer High School was known as kind of the Italian high school. And you can see the Ironbound was filled with a lot of different nationalities. And the black population was mainly right in the downtown, in the brick towers areas. So in the actual downtown area, the Central Ward was where you had the majority of the black population. And this is again around the turn of the century, 1911, and you can see that black people constituted only 11,000 of the population, relatively speaking, a relatively small part of the population. So, how did this change along with many other northern cities and northeastern cities? Well, first of all, we have to go back to the 1930s and the New Deal. So, in the New Deal, a program called the Homeowners Loan Corporation was created. And this essentially established a government lending organization that would give mortgages. So, it would basically give people money, loan people money to build or buy houses. Over the course of the 40 years of the program, 75% of all the loans were for new homes in the suburbs and not for renovating urban centers that grew in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So the urban cities are going into decay at this point. They are in need of revival, but all the government investment is going into building the suburbs. Also, the government officials and banking officials who gave out these loans actually drew red lines on the map. This is literally where the term comes from. And this practice was called redlining. So the Federal Housing Authority and the Homeowners Loan Corporation would actually draw red lines in the map, around the map, saying that these are the places where you have lower value areas, places where you had aging populations or where you had more minorities, more black people, more Hispanic people, more Chinese, more of the people that were commonly discriminated against. Italians as well, to a lesser extent, Italians and Irish. By this point, they enjoyed a little bit of a better treatment than some of those other groups, but it was still pretty bad. Now, here's actually from the book Crabgrass Frontier, which is an excellent book on this topic specifically about the white flight out of urban cities in this time period. You can see that most of the mortgages are not going to the city of Newark. Most of the mortgages for the Federal Housing Administration in 1936, right in this New Deal program, are going in Bloomfield, in Belleville, in Nutley, in Glen Ridge, in Milburn, in Maplewood, in Livingston, all these places in the suburbs of Newark, not actually in Newark itself. So most of the investment is, again, not going in the areas which are mostly comprised of, which have the highest minority populations, but in the areas of white flight, where the white people are moving to, the suburban areas. Why is white flight happening? Well, it's not just racism, but interestingly enough, and this had a huge effect on the city of Newark, realtors actually were incentivized to use racism to try to increase their sales. This was a practice called blockbusting. So a realtor would go into a white neighborhood and saying, black people are moving into the neighborhood. They're coming, and your home's gonna lose all its value because once this neighborhood starts turning black, the home values are gonna decline. And this used to be a pristine, segregated white neighborhood. Now it's all gonna go to crap. And they used to spread these stereotypes about black people dumping garbage out their windows and having these filthy habits. And these stereotypes persisted into the 60s, into the time of the riots. You can see it in some of the primary sources, some of the newspaper interviews of people like the North Ward kind of patrols that used to patrol the streets for black people. And they had all these kind of stereotypical ideas about black people. But this was encouraged in order to encourage white property owners to move out and sell their homes so that realtors could get a commission and so that banks could get more loans and charge fees on those loans. So between 1950 and 1960, approximately 115,000 white people left Newark. Between 1960 and 1967, 70,000. If you look at the composition of attorneys who actually work in Newark yet live in the suburbs, you can see it consistently go up. That might even be higher today. Now, couple this with what was going on at the time called the Great Migration. So many African Americans are leaving the South. They're leaving situations that were unfair in the post-Civil War era, like sharecropping, like segregation and Jim Crow laws, and the lynching and KKK that we've talked about in the past, the presence of KKK, even in the criminal justice system. Judges and police were all members of these organizations that were outright racist. So African Americans are leaving the South in droves, and they're going to places like Chicago, like Detroit, like Akron, Ohio, like New Jersey, Newark, like New York City and other places in the Northeast. And this leads to massive population changes. So we can see the African American population consistently going up, and you'll see the composition of African Americans in Newark consistently going up over this time period as well. Between 1940 and 1960, 28,000 African Americans entered Newark. You can see the percentage of the black population go up and up and up to the point where I think it's around that today. It might be it might be slightly higher or slightly lower, but it's right around that today, the African American composition in Newark today. So as neighborhoods became African American, we saw the percentage of unemployed go up because many of the unions were forbidding black membership, so they refused African Americans from the labor unions, and many employers would refuse to hire black people. So that meant that as neighborhoods became more black, you saw higher unemployment rates. And we can see Weequahic High School, by 1968, by the time of the riots, the neighborhood had changed drastically in the course of 7 years. I mean, look at that. It went from 19% black in 1961 to 82% black in 1968. That's a massive transformation in a short period of time. So this, while not by law, was a kind of segregation. And we could see that the city of Newark is still somewhat segregated. The wards are somewhat racially divided. It's a little bit different, but this has largely characterized the city for a long time. We'll get into some specific ways. But as we saw that New Deal funding primarily going to the suburbs, like I said, the urban buildings and housing situations got worse and worse. So the places where minorities are living are just in need of repair. And by the way, most of the minority lived in dwellings are not owned by minorities. So most of the black populated buildings are not actually owned by black people. Only 5% of all new housing units were for low income families around this time period. So therefore, most of the housing for African Americans was pretty awful. These were the brick towers. This is what became known as the Brick City. There were lots of these housing projects. And as I mentioned before, very few of the labor unions in the city were open to blacks. So there was massive inequality here. Now you can see here that this was a factory city. And this is the reason that people came to this town. So look at each dot represents a single factory. So 2,000 factories in the city of Newark. And this was right around the turn of the century, so in the very early 1900s. So all over the city, you could get jobs in these factories. In the 1940s and 50s, if you just had a high school diploma, you could easily get a pretty decent job in one of these factories. And we can see the remnants of many of these manufacturing facilities all around the city. Now lots of them are hollowed out buildings. This is the Lister's Agricultural Chemical Works right on the river. Dumped lots of fun stuff in the river shortly. The Ballantine breweries, there were several of them, including the former Science High School. Heller Brothers, a lot of these old buildings. This one's gone now. This was in the West Ward, down by Route 78. They knocked this thing down now. And then, of course, Science High School. I think I'm going to stop it here because we're going to talk about how all these factories went from vibrant job centers to hollowed out buildings all boarded up. We'll take a look at that next time.